Hi, my name is Robert Paul Jester. Thank you to the organizers for including me, and I apologize for not being with you in person. Unfortunately, Trumpty Dumpty is making things a little bit difficult. Starting with questioning the very nature of sex, saying that there are only two genders or two sexes, and also by removing many grants from the NIH, some of which I was involved with. So apologies for not being here, but I'd like to emphasize the point that sex is a continuum and measuring sex and gender, as well as sexual orientation and gender identity, is benefits from taking these very continuous approaches. So to start off, sex is really everything that's biological in nature, so chromosomes, physical features, phenotypes, while gender relates to everything that's sociocultural. I'm very interested in looking at the LGBTQ plus community because there's a lot more diversity, although sexual orientation is not necessarily a gender variable. That being said, there is a lot more diversity in gender expression among the community. So starting off with sex, this diagram by my student Enzo Cipriani does a really good job of emphasizing that when we're talking about biological sex, we're really missing out by just asking people what is their sex assigned at birth. There are intersex individuals as well. We know that this is a proportion of the population that's quite underrepresented and often unknown unless genetic tests are done to look at chromosomes. So even sex as a variable can be considered along different continuums, intersex being an example, but even chromosomes, hormones such as testosterone, progesterone, estradiol, as well as phenotypes. So I start with this distinction because biological sex at its core is a continuum along many different dimensions. And so before we get into gender, we sort of have to take into account that reality. I like this diagram because, of course, it was in the Lancet, but it kind of emphasizes the attributes between females and males involves fragile, emotional for feminine traits and risk-taking and aggression for masculine traits. So it shows these stereotypes perpetuate even today, despite the fact that this article was in 2019. I want to make the distinction now between gender identity, gender relations, gender roles, and institutionalized gender because it has an important place in much of the work that I'm going to present today. So gender identity tends to be what's most proximal to the individual. It's how an individual self-identifies, including how they behave, express their gender, and are perceived by others. At a level more interpersonal, that is gender roles, so social expectations and norms typically associated with a given gender. So we can think of the BEM sex role inventory as being a way of looking at this. At a level even more macro is gender relations, so how individuals interact and are treated and what are the gender expectations within a certain society. And at the most macro level, institutionalized gender, so the way that power, resources, opportunities are distributed in society. I'm going to talk a little bit towards the end of this presentation, innovative ways that institutionalized gender and structural sexism can be considered in relation to research on structural stigma related to sexual orientation and gender identity. This is a great paper by Lorraine Greaves and Stacey Ritz that does a really good job of defining these four different components of gender. And while today I'm going to focus mostly on some work mostly with my colleague Zachary Dubois in relation to gender identity, it's important to note that gender is a much more complicated and much more interesting variable than just gender identity. Gender identity is a core of much of the work that I'm going to present, but I'd just like to point out that all of these variables are intertwined, and this is what we often refer to as gender-sex entanglement. Gender also can be measured. I mentioned the BEM sex role inventory. This is a scale looking at masculine and feminine traits as well as androgyny, although it's lost favor over the years because women are reporting more masculinity than men over the course of the last 50 years. And a lot of contemporary feminists have an issue with that. And so this scale needs to be updated. Then there's also multidimensional approaches, so looking at gender identity. And here the strategy is often to ask people what is their gender identity and their lived gender before asking any questions about birth assigned sex, if at all. This is something that comes out from a lot of discussions with the community that unless you actually have to measure or include birth assigned sex, such as some of the work we're doing with hormones, it's maybe not even worth asking people about their birth assigned sex. Another strategy is to ask people in an open-ended way. what are the different gender identities, as well as different sexual orientations that they identify with. And so this is a strategy that we use in our lab. And also to incorporate measures of gender identity, sexual orientation that are along continuums. So we have some data that we're collecting currently that goes from a scale of 0 to 100 on different spectrums. I'm going to turn now to some work on very central to the theme of this conference, psychoneuroendocrinology, in relation to stress physiology and resilience. So much of the work that we do looks at diurnal cortisol as well as reactive cortisol in order to see differences based on sex, gender, and among the LGBTQ plus community. And much of the work that we do focuses on Bruce McEwen's allostatic load model, the wear and tear of chronic stress on multiple physiological systems. And much of my career, starting with Sonia Lupien and Jens Prusner, has been dedicated to understanding sex and gender in relation to cortisol, allostatic load, and mental health. So starting off with sexual orientation, I just want to point out that psychiatry and neuroscience, we know there's a dark history with regards to sexual orientation and gender identity. But in the last 10 years, we're seeing this emergence of research that's focusing on the health disparities of the community, but also focusing on positive psychology. So trying to understand factors of resilience in addition to those related to stigma. And much of this research is informed by sexual minority stress, research that much like the stress and resilience field that borrows terminology from engineering, stigma uses the same kind of language. So proximal stigma or stress processes are those more internalized and more proximal to the individual, like the coming out process, while those that are more distal can be imagined as geospatial, victimization, discrimination, etc. And this model says that being a minority is related to specific stressors that increase the risk of mental health outcomes, but are also associated with very unique resilience strategies that are starting to be explored a lot more in this literature in relation to physiology. And this is an important model that put forward looking at stress biomarkers in relation to minority stress. And so I had the good fortune when being a student with Sonia Lupien to look at this among Montrealers. And in the first study, we looked at sex hormones and found that testosterone and progesterone was higher among sexual minority women. This is a finding that came out a lot in the 1980s. It was partially explained by higher levels of DHEA and lower levels of LDL cholesterol, which are required to make these steroid hormones. One of the limitations of this work is that we don't actually look at the environmental context. And so when we did in these analysis, we found that lesbian and bisexual women that were reporting more distress in their environment had higher levels of testosterone and progesterone. And those higher levels were actually explaining higher cortisol reactivity to the Trier social stress test. You see here that sexual minority women are responding with more cortisol reactivity 40 minutes after the stressor, while gay and bisexual men are not responding at all. So this is important to take into account these biological sex-based variations when looking at sexual orientation as we did here. When looking at diurnal cortisol, we didn't find any differences based on sexual orientation, but we found that those that had completely come out of the closet to their family and their friends had lower levels of cortisol. Same finding for mental health. Those that had come out of the closet had less anxiety, less depression, and less burnout than those that had not. And as a group, that was explaining the lack of differences in comparison to heterosexual people. So this really points out the importance of the coming out process when looking at these kinds of associations. We next looked at allostatic load based on 20 different biomarkers and found that gay and bisexual men actually had lower allostatic load than heterosexual men. It was explained by lower BMI, lower triglycerides, and lower interleukin-6. No differences among women. We were a bit perplexed by these results. Were they potentially explained by coming out processes? We did some secondary data analysis and actually did find that those that engaged in less avoidance in their coming out process had lower allostatic load, and those that engaged in more seeking social support had less perceived stress currently. So I just want to emphasize that when looking at sexual minority groups, it's important to keep into account the coming out process and to account for these different sources of proximal stress, as well as distal stress in the form of discrimination scales, which we did not actually look at in this first study. So during my postdoc, I wanted to see, would this pan out in the US? And so I had access to a very large data set from the NHANES study and found, again, the gay men had the lowest allostatic load, but bisexual men were the ones with the highest allostatic load. And this is an important finding because it shows the importance of splitting between subgroups and not just clumping everyone together, because we know that bisexual groups actually experience more stigma. No differences were found among women, but this could be explained by the fact that there are different combinations of protective factors among lesbian and gay men. So here, the more green a profile is, the more favorable it is, and the more red, the least. And you see that there's kind of a mix of findings with this cohort of the NHANES based on 43 different studies. So lesbian women are less engaged in risky sexual behavior. Gay men have higher income, more education, lower BMI, exercise more, and a mix of alcohol use. These variables could potentially be explaining these differences that we're seeing. So future research should take into account these health-related behaviors. And what I'd like to argue is that different minority groups are going to be appropriating different health-related behaviors that could modulate or moderate these associations. Turning now to a more macroscopic perspective, this is work inspired by Mark Katzenbuehler, who looks state by state, where do people live and how does that influence their mental health? This is a first really pioneering study looked at those that grew up in more stigmatizing states related to sexual orientation, and found that those that grew up in states with less protections for sexual minorities had a blunted cortisol response. So during my postdoc with Mark, I wanted to see if this would pan out again with the NHANES in relation to allostatic load. So we were able to stratify structural stigma based on 10 different laws from 2001 to 2014. And what we found was that gay and bisexual men that lived in states with more protections had lower allostatic load, but the effect wasn't there for women. And this is perplexing, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit later on in this presentation, that it might be related more to gender inequalities trumping other forms of adversity in explaining these differences. This is a study, I won't go into the details, but it just basically shows that in the Swiss referendum, looking at hair cortisol before the referendum, during the referendum, and after the referendum, those of the LGBTQ plus community that were involved in the most activism were the ones that showed the highest levels of cortisol, but also then the lowest decrease, the biggest decreases in those levels once the referendum passed favorably. So this is really interesting work and could be replicated in other jurisdictions where there might be changes in laws that affect the community. So in 2020, my group was awarded a sex and gender science chair in order to pursue this work. And we were really dedicated to understanding all the different unique experiences of the LGBTQ alphabet soup. And while this can be a little bit vexing for our grandparents, we really wanted to try to represent groups that were underrepresented. So pansexual, asexual, intersex is a group that we still want to work more with, but especially transgender and non-binary communities. And so we engaged with working with different scholars in this space and thinking about ways to engage in partnership with the community in order to do this work. And so I wanted to do brain imaging research with transgender individuals, and this was possible during my postdoc with Walter Bochting, who's dedicated his career to working in the trans community. But as a young scholar, I really needed to engage with the community and gain their trust and identify what their needs were. And just like sexual minority stress models are important for sexually diverse individuals, there have been models also developed for the transgender community that are pretty identical. Distal stresses that are unique to the community, proximal stressors that are unique that will increase the risk of mental and physical health problems, but also unique resilience factors that help buffer these effects. So before starting any of our research looking at spit and blood and microbiome, we decided to do interviews with transgender and non-binary Montrealers to ask them, what are your health needs? What are your wellness needs? What is stress and resilience for you? And then to see what were some of the methodologies that we use, explaining it to them and then seeing their willingness to engage. We did this with 31 people for interviews that lasted about 3 hours, and we're working on the data right now that we'll be submitting soon to the special issue in comprehensive psychoneuroendocrinology. This just is a little sneak peek developed by one of my students, Gaia Guano, who is looking at the methodologies that are very typical of our field. And the two that came out as the most problematic were stool samples and anthropometric measures, especially body mass index, that for many transgender individuals was a reminder of their birth assigned sex. Stool sampling was also something that was a little bit, well, I think a lot of people find it a bit nasty, but all the same, in a sample of about 400 people that we were able to get with our sex and gender science chair, we have been able to get it for about 300 people. Much of this work is informed by my collaboration with Zachary Dubois, who's been a pioneer looking in work among transgender communities and integrating much of the stress biomarkers that we look at. This is a study that we did a few years ago looking at allostatic load, where we found that those living in spaces and states that are already pretty progressive, that had more, that were less progressive, so more conservative and more rural, were the ones that had the highest allostatic load, while everything that was related more to transgender experiences were related much more to mental health. So Zach and some other colleagues like Jay Puckett did a beautiful study before and after the election of Biden, and we're starting to have some first results coming out. And I want to emphasize the importance of looking at stigma and looking at vulnerability among the trans community, but also taking into account resilience and protective factors. So what you see here is that enacted stigma is related to a blunted cortisol response, high levels right before going to bed. This mirrors much of what we see in the discrimination literature. Some of the work by Stephanie Cook has found similar results among Black men who have sex with men. Interestingly, when we looked at community connectedness, it was positively associated with the cortisol awakening response. So we're happy that we incorporated that measure and encourage other people to also take into account these positive health psychology measures as well. Unfortunately, the trans community is under attack both in the US as well as in Canada. So this work is extremely important, and we actually are part of a special issue led by Robert Danzer, along with Tanya Podiat and Sari Resner and myself. We've extended the deadline to probably being somewhere in 2026. If you have any questions, please contact me or Robert. We're encouraging articles on really all kinds of different aspects related to transgender and non-binary communities. And so much of our work in my lab is continuing to add to the sexual and gender minority stress models by incorporating biomarkers and by putting in place for resilience factors like coping strategies, social supports, and community resources. So just in closing, I want to talk about intersectionality as well as institutionalized gender, because I think it's really central when thinking about differences in health disparities among sexual minorities and gender diverse and non-binary people. And I just want to point to this study that was done in 2011 that showed that women that lived in states that did not have abortion laws that protected them experienced greater depression. And I think in the overturning of Roe versus Wade in the last few years in the US, the pertinence of this work is extremely important. And I want to point out that the work that I did with Mark Katzenbuehler looking at structural stigma based on sexual orientation could be done in exactly the same way looking at structural sexism. And this is the work that I really find inspiring by Patricia Holman that looks at structural sexism across the United States by indexing what is the proportion of women in politics, what's the gender pay gap, what are abortion laws in place, and then seeing how that relates to physical health conditions, to self-rated health, and to physical functioning. I think it would be wonderful for the field of psychoneuroendocrinology to be able to take this approach and perhaps even combine it with structural stigma related to sexual orientation or structural stigma related to transphobia in order to nuance these geospatial pressures on individuals' health. And lastly, with intersectionality, we can't talk about sex, gender, sexual orientation without considering intersectionality, which is the experience of multiple marginalized identities. Stephanie Cook is leading a wonderful special issue in psychoneuroendocrinology on this topic. And we're now starting to see research that's actually integrating biomarkers. I'm going to show some work with my team based on Aidan Shame and Greta Bauer's intersectional discrimination index, which actually allows us to look at an individual's experience of major lifetime experiences of intersectional discrimination. And what we find, this is some data that's under review for about it's 357 people. It's data from my chair. If we look at birth assigned sex, as we've done with allostatic load, we see that birth assigned males have higher allostatic load. This isn't surprising, it's been shown in the literature. But then when we split it by gender identity, we find transgender men and cisgender men are the ones that are driving this difference compared to cisgender women. And then when we split by sexual orientation and gender identity, we find that it's heterosexual men, bisexual men, and gay men that are showing the highest allostatic load compared to other groups. As I continue this work, we want to better represent other groups like asexual groups, intersex groups, etc. And now when we look at intersectionality, we find that allostatic load is positively associated to major lifetime discrimination and day-to-day discrimination. So some results that are preliminary that we're still working on, but really pointing to the importance of taking an intersectional lens when looking at allostatic load. And so in closing, I want to just give a shout out to this book led by Zachary Dubois and some colleagues that I think does this really good job to give a state of the art of sex and gender research, especially the concept of intersectionality as well as gender entanglement. And then I just want to point out, this is a colleague in Canada, Nancy Poole, who just got the Order of Canada. This is a wonderful publication for really thinking about how to go from gender inequality to gender equity in health research. And I highly encourage anyone that's interested in this work to look at this reference. And finally, for students in the room, these are great modules by the Canadian Institutes of Health that allows extra lines in your CV, but also ways to learn about sex and gender research in Canada. So with that, I'd like to thank my laboratory, our sources of funding, and to encourage you to follow us on social media. Thank you very much.